Talk shoes. Recorded live.
Hello and welcome to Castle of Horror, the interview segment where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre world. From Denver, Colorado, I'm your host, Jason Henderson, creator of the Alex Van Helsing novels. And tonight we're talking to Chris Vander Kaay, author with Kathleen, Kaay, of the book The Anatomy of Fear, Conversations with Cult Horror and Science Fiction Filmmakers, which just came out in paperback. Now, here's what we know about the book. During in-depth conversations with 21 horror and science fiction film writers and directors of a lot of films that you have heard of, and I'm going to ask Chris about it, filmmaker Chris and Kathleen Vander Kaay get the inside story on the inspiration, creation, and behind-the-scenes experiences of box office blockbusters. What I really like about it is that the writers and directors that they talk to spend a lot of time just talking about their philosophy of horror and entertainment at large. So, Chris, tell me a little bit about yourself, and then let's get into the book.
Okay, well, Jason, thanks for having me on the show. Kathy sends her regards. She can't be here because of a deadline, but we appreciate you having us on. I guess what we could tell you about us is that we're husband and wife writing team. We're going for our master's degree, and we're also screenwriters as well as being authors. And, to not list our credits, I'll just say you can go to inthemargin.net to learn more about us. But we spent a long time trying to convince people that horror is not only fun to watch, but is worth talking about on a social and cultural level.
All right. So one thing I wanted to say about this book when I looked at it, okay, so The Anatomy of Fear is fundamentally an interview book, right? And, I've read a lot of interview books. I remember reading, Rex Reed has done a number of books where he'll, one chapter he's talking to Jeff Bridges, and the next chapter he's talking to Cary Grant or whatever it is. And each chapter talks to a different person. But instead, what you've done here is you've done this in more of a way if we're producing a documentary, because each chapter is on a different topic. And then you take the people that you've interviewed and you give whatever they had to say about that particular topic, again, in the way that you would if you were cutting back to somebody who's doing a documentary. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the people that you talk to and, the different topics that they're going over?
Definitely. Well, first of all, I have to credit Kathy for coming up with that idea, because originally I guess my idea would have been more a Rex Reed book, but Kathy thought that a more interesting way to do it would be divided amongst themes, and we broke it up sort of not of this world, which is about aliens. We did a section on vampires, formative film memories, and then what we would do is as we would talk to each of the filmmakers, we knew which films we were talking to them about, and we would try and connect thematically both what they worked on within that genre, what their inspiration was, and then, like you said, philosophically, what it is that they see within that framework, what it is that interests them as a filmmaker, that draws them to that subject matter. And
did you already know what the themes were when you were interviewing them? Like, you already knew, one was going to be about formative memories, or did you take a look at the interviews that you did afterwards and draw the themes out of them?
Yeah, well, a couple of sections we knew for sure. The formative film memories was one, and then obviously Nightmares on the Set. Those were, opening and closing sections of the book we definitely wanted. But basically what we did is we tried to talk to them about as many of their films as we could, and then the ones that were the most interesting and then sort of mined the most fascinating social and psychological elements, we picked them out. We sort of cherry-picked the best stuff and then figured out how to categorize them. And some of them became obvious. You're going to have a section about vampires, or you're going to have a section about ghosts, demons, and the supernatural. And so we sort of divided along those lines, but we did it by talking to them about everything and then choosing the things we felt made the most interesting conversations.
What are Nightmares on the Set?
Nightmares on the Set was a section that I'm always interested in, especially as a person who works in filmmaking myself. Kathy and I are screenwriters, in telling stories that encourage other filmmakers, that even the people who you like, the people who are successful, have terrible, terrible days trying to get things made. And so the closing chapter of the book is essentially about everyone's sort of worst experience working in the industry. And it's fun because it's encouraging to see that even the guy who made the Tremors franchise in the Wild Wild West, he had terrible, terrible days,
That's actually some of my favorite stuff in reading about books. I loved Fiasco, which is a book that's entirely about Hollywood disasters. I think there's a lot that can be learned from studying, things that go wrong. Sometimes good ideas that go horribly wrong, and sometimes terrible ideas that absolutely deserve to go, as badly as they went. Did you not to pick on something, but Island of Dr. Moreau, the new one with Marlon Brando, new.
Right.
Sorry, it's now 15 years old or something. But somebody said to me recently, don't ever mention Dr. Moreau in a pitch meeting because the toxicity of the 1998 Dr. Moreau literally scares executives into leaving the room. They literally will not, you just can't mention Dr. Moreau anymore. That was how powerfully badly that movie went. There's actually a new documentary about exactly that, and I was wondering if you had seen it. I'm trying to remember. I think it's called Lost Souls, in fact.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet. I know it's premiered at some festivals. I'm actually fascinated by the subgenre of either films that didn't happen or films that almost were. Obviously, Jodorowsky's Dune is another one in that sort of same vein. And Kathy and I are huge fans of stuff like that because I think one of the things that people don't realize is unless you are Marvel, every film is a massive struggle to get made. And sometimes the most fascinating part of the movie is actually the process to get it done rather than the film itself, which is actually emblematic of a lot of what we talk about in the book, is the philosophy behind the film and also what it's like as a filmmaker to be working on instinct with no budget and sort of just hammering away to get a vision made.
I mean, I love seeing. I'm looking at your chapter now about disasters. Finding out that your actor has sent you a message saying he hates the script and he's dropping out of the movie, which happens, happens all the time if you have a big enough star. And that's one of those struggles. I've heard people talking about, putting a movie together and having to play some kind of chess, where you find, let's find a big enough actor for the main part, and let's find a big enough actor for the supporting part. And the actor for the supporting part can't be as big. And if he is one ethnicity, then the other actor can't be the same ethnicity because they don't want, two of the same ethnicity in one, unless everybody's white.
Right.
Craziness. And all of these things are, all you wanted to do was write, some new adaptation of Don't Look Now that takes place in New England, but instead what's happening is that you're involved in these ridiculous conversations about who's a big enough star that you can get. I wanted to read to you a quotation that comes from the book. So this is from Larry Fessenden, who wrote a movie called Habit and also was a producer on House of the Devil. And he says, and I'm wondering if you did this interview or if Kathleen did, but Larry says, I just find it immensely tiring. He goes, I find it immensely tiring when people say they just want to go to the movies for entertainment. I think we should re-examine what we even mean by entertainment. Do you mean a series of mindless images that have no sticking power? Is that truly entertainment? ... We just assume it's entertaining to watch Trek. I just feel condescended to it. I feel the weight of corporatism nudging into my mind. What did you think about that quotation?
Well, yeah, first of all, I will say I generally conduct the interviews. Kathy does the hard work of doing the research and knowing things, and then she lets me have the fun, which is really nice of her. But in talking to Larry, one of the things I love the most about Larry Fessenden, and he's sort of a patron saint of the independent horror movement. He's worked with every great young horror filmmaker, and the reason I'm so glad he's doing it is because he has a really unique perspective on what horror should be. If horror is the only genre that's allowed to make us uncomfortable, then we should take that opportunity to talk about anything that makes us uncomfortable, whether it be death or bad relationships or politics or anything that we're not comfortable talking about publicly or having a good time with in the theater. That's what horror should be talking about, because it's the only place we're allowed.
And he's so literate, this guy. I mean, he's like quoting from Algernon Blackwood, the English story writer. He's mentioning all these different things. He's talking about how he might, how he was supposed to adapt. One of my favorite stories from him is where he talks about he was going to adapt The Orphanage, the wonderful, amazing Spanish horror film. And he had a vision for it that just made me think, this guy would be so fun to talk to, because he wanted to make it into a Gothic New England film, and put it on the cliffs and all that groovy lighthouse stuff. And ultimately, all of that got scuttled simply because of the budget, because people didn't want to shoot in the United States. And this is just a really smart guy. But I wanted to ask you, do you believe that's true, what he just said? In other words, if horror, according to Larry, exists to make us explore what makes us uncomfortable, then why is there a place? And I think I'm getting to the notion that I think there's a place. But is there a place for Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein? Or is there a place for, I don't know. I mean, Tremors, they say that Tremors is about commercialism. But in a big sense, Tremors is just a movie that has a whole lot of fun. I mean, does horror have to be? Does it have to make us think deeply, or I'm just trying to figure out what is your opinion about this? I mean, does it have to fit any of these theses?
Well, that's the thing I love the most about horror, actually, is it's the thing with the most nebulous boundaries of all genres. You can do anything in a horror film, and that's not true of any other genre. At a certain point, once you cross a certain line, you're no longer that genre. If you're too funny, you're not a drama anymore.
Right.
If you're too serious, you're too gory, you're not a comedy. But anything can happen in a horror film, and that's not something that any other genre can say. And I think the way that horror, and like you were talking about horror comedy being fun, I think one of the great things about horror is the first time you go to a movie, it's for the experience, whether it's the horror comedy to have fun or whether it's the straight horror to be scared. The great thing is that horror fans are loyal. They come back to movies over and over again. So the first time you're allowed to have the visceral experience, and the second time you're allowed to take home the message.
That's a really good point. And a lot of times we watch things and some of the themes will come back, with every successive viewing. I mean, Danny Peary, who's one of my favorite writers about film, actually wrote a really amazing chapter about Plan 9 from Outer Space, which, by all accounts, is a terribly made film. And yet he was like, there are themes here that are very interesting. It's very interesting watching this crude film make its points and try to bring up the notion of the army keeping secrets, and it's easy to forget that actually that was not actually something people were talking a lot about in the time when Plan 9 from Outer Space came out. You do an interview with William Wisher. He's the director, the screenwriter of Terminator and Terminator 2, and also Exorcist Dominion, which we recently reviewed on the show. I really loved his discussion of like the difference between those two films. The fact that Terminator, going to your point about different kinds of horror, Terminator is essentially a slasher film, very informed by Friday the 13th and Halloween and all that stuff. Whereas Terminator 2 is, I don't even know what you'd call it. I mean, it's basically the ultimate action movie.
Yeah, it's interesting. He actually calls it "It's a Wonderful Life with Guns."
Oh, I loved. So that means that you got to have this long conversation with him about all the many alternate realities that might exist in the Terminator universe.
Oh, yeah. No, honestly, if I could do an entire book just talking to William Wisher about the fascinating intricacies of what he and James Cameron and friends discussed about that universe, just in the two films that they did, let alone what else they had thought about and never ended up doing in subsequent sequels, there is an unbelievably fertile amount of information there. And certainly someone, hopefully at some point in time, will sit down and mine all of that beautiful information into something.
There's something else that strikes me about that. It's very cool to get to talk to that guy because, he's there talking about time travel and he's talking about Terminator 2 and what it means and where it fits into genre. But that screenplay, and I don't know if he would necessarily walk around thinking about this, but the Terminator 2 screenplay is actually quite important. Sid Field dedicated an entire chapter of his book for screenplays to it and uses the Terminator 2 screenplay as a template for a perfectly made thriller screenplay. And, because he talks about how William Wisher divided that script into, I think, 7 perfect segments. It's, because you have the opening where they introduce everybody, and then it's, opening where they introduce everybody, then it's rescue John, and then it's go rescue Mom, and then it's midpoint at Enrique's, and then it's go get the scientist, and then it's go to Cyberdyne, and then it's escape from Cyberdyne and go to the big factory. 7 scenes. The whole movie is basically just, is just these 7 segments that are strung together with just perfect precision, and there's emotion, and there's payoffs, and there's everything. Terminator 2 is a rock-solid, perfect screenplay. And I think it's really cool that you get to spend so much time talking to this guy.
Yeah, and Wisher himself said one of the reasons why that the screenplay came out as successfully as it did, even though they actually wrote it over a very short amount of time, is that there was years between the original and the sequel. No one knew exactly who owned the rights, whether or not it would get greenlit. And so, he and James Cameron are casual friends and got together all the time, and they would constantly be talking about it, getting all of the bad ideas out of the way, refining and honing out, so that by the time they sat down in front of a typewriter, the work was really just getting what they had already formed out onto the page.
Let me ask you something. What was, when you began this project, how long did it take you to do the project overall? How long did it take you to interview all these people?
Well, the actual writing of the project didn't take as long as obviously bringing it to a publisher and getting it out in the world. But I would say from the first interview to the final draft of the book would be somewhere between 10 and 11 months.
10 and 11 months. So in the course of all of that, you come up with your questions, you interview all these people, generally on the phone or in person?
On the phone. I'd love to say in person, but no, we're in Central Florida, so it was on the phone.
All right. So you're talking to all these people on the phone. So once it's all done, was anything a great surprise to you? Did you come out of it with a thought about horror that was different from what you thought it would be?
I would say the thing that was the biggest surprise to me was how influenced people's entire careers were on the films that they saw when they were children. That they didn't realize that they were constantly revisiting themes that fascinated them when they were 6, 7, or 8 years old.
Your formative films concepts, right?
What's that?
This is your formative film experiences concept.
Right, exactly. I think the best example is Eric Red, the writer of Explorers, which is an amazing mid-'80s science fiction children's adventure film. And so much of the material in that film is discussing the same things that his two favorite childhood movies were, which is The Red Balloon and The Wizard of Oz. And so many of the themes of those two movies pop up all over Explorers in ways that he didn't even really know how to articulate until we were talking about it, and he was sort of realizing in real time how he'd been revisiting things that fascinated him from his childhood.
Let me ask you this. So you write screenplays, so is that true of you as well?
I think probably it is true, but I think one of the things that's usually the most telling is when someone else starts to ask you about it. I think you always have to think back to your...
I interrupted you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think you always have a blind spot yourself for the things that are most interesting to you. And I think, if I were to analyze myself a little bit, I would say my two favorite films from when I was a child are the animated Disney Alice in Wonderland and the live-action Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I guess Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And I love those movies. And as I look at my work and the work that Kathy and I do together, I realize I have a love for characters working straight-faced through absurd situations.
Yes.
And that sort of seems to be emblematic of those two films from my childhood. So I guess if I had to pick a theme that seems like it keeps working its way in, that would be the one.
It is. You're right. I have never thought about that in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but everybody does take it completely at face value, no matter how strange things are. It's funny about the Disney Alice in Wonderland, because is it me or that? I mean, that film. To me, it's almost the forgotten Disney film. You don't hear a lot about that version of Alice in Wonderland, except at Disneyland. You'll still see some of the arts and stuff like that, and it's worked its way into the rides. But,
I think there was a short period at Disney where, it was after, some of the 9 old men were still working, but Walt Disney himself was a little hands-off. There were movies like that and Robin Hood, films that were sort of before the relaunch that happened sort of post-Fox and the Hound. There's a few titles that tend to get like a little bit lost before the Disney Renaissance came again. And I definitely agree that that's one of them, but I think it's so crazy because to me, one of the things I love about it as a child is that there's this limitless imagination to the idea of a place like Wonderland.
Absolutely.
And even if the movie doesn't pay off the dividends, it at least makes that an option for you, so that when you walk out of the movie, your brain can go down all the paths that Alice didn't walk, and that's kind of where my brain has been ever since.
Right. Well, that's interesting. So, and when you talk about a formative film experience, are you thinking about like the stuff that deeply affected you when you were a kid? In other words, you see a movie and you just can't stop thinking about it, or is it one that might be disturbing but you never saw it again? I mean, what are the things that qualify in your mind?
Well, when I think of formative, I think of two things. The first one is the first one that you said, the idea that it's a story that you revisited, a story that you loved, a story that is sort of elemental to who you are as a person, and particularly in this case as a filmmaker or as a writer. But then the other one is, for me, formative is when someone understood what a movie was. Like, there's a certain point nowadays where I think sophistication comes much and much earlier, but it used to be people could watch movies before they understood what movies were. And so sometimes I think a formative film memory, like in the case of John Bruno talked about seeing a movie and not understanding what Ray Harryhausen effects were at one point, and then realizing at some point that that's an effect. It's not happening. It's being created. And that's a formative film memory for me.
Yeah, I was just thinking about something that, tell me if you had this experience. When I was a kid, I would watch, and I'm talking about like under 10, right? So I'd come across movies on TV that were like the Santo movies and various like ultra-Catholic Mexican horror movies and stuff like that would play on like Saturday afternoon, or Italian horror movies, and things like Castle of Blood and so forth. And those movies always, the people would talk, but they were dubbed. To me, this was somehow reflective, and I think I was surely I was old enough to understand that these were movies and they weren't real, and so what I was thinking didn't make any sense. But to me, they were showing another universe where words were somehow slightly disconnected from people's mouths, where sounds didn't quite connect to the world. So there was something more magical about the crudeness of these, like, chopped up, dubbed, poor horror films brought over here and just dumped onto Saturday morning TV. There was something very real and fantastic about those worlds to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's that same sort of magical crudeness to the classic Rankin Bass Christmas specials and holiday
Absolutely, yes.
There's something that's actually more magical because you can see the fingerprints a little bit, because there's a sort of a shop-worn element to it that makes it feel like it's from another place, like it's almost like it's an artifact that was found rather than made.
And it feels magical. Somehow if you set up a room to look like a winter wonderland, right, and you've got frost on the windows and you've got strange sort of plastic and glass ornaments to create all the snow, and big white felt, somehow that, I think, makes our hearts glow a little bit more than if I were to create a perfect, illusion of the winter. Somehow the sort of the decoration piece makes us feel more at home, or it makes me feel more. Maybe I shouldn't universalize. I think that's true of horror as well. As I've gotten older, I've found myself more and more attracted to sort of the crude horror of, the early days of the 40s and the 50s, where you can see the wires, because that, by turning it into symbol, you can start to try to think about what does the symbol mean, instead of just simply admiring like whether or not it's believable.
Yeah, and I think one of the great things that ever happened to horror is that horror was born during the Hays Code. It was born at a time when people were not allowing you to do certain things, and I think in a way horror flourishes when you have to talk around things rather than about.
No, absolutely. Okay, we should definitely wrap up, but well, tell you what, it's been wonderful talking to you. I would really like to hear, if you want to wrap up yourself, tell us anything else that you'd like us to know, and also where you can get The Anatomy of Fear, and hear a whole bunch of people continuing talking exactly about what we've been talking about. But no doubt, you and them, it'll be a twice as sophisticated conversation. So tell us about getting the book and anything else you'd like.
Well, sure. Obviously, Amazon is a great place to get the book. We're available through Barnes & Noble, and then our website is theanatomyoffear.com, just the name of the book.com. And we're working on a couple of new books that we're really excited about that are also about the horror genre, different aspects and different corners of it. And to keep up with those books and when they're going to be coming out, you can go to the blog I mentioned before, inthemargin.net. But one book is about horror subgenres, the 70 horror subgenres we think exist and what they say about horror psychology. And then the other book is sort of about how you can track the changes in society and culture based on watching entries in a film franchise as they go through the years, tracking how society and how those societies' changes are reflected in the entries as you watch them.
Wow. Give me an example of that. I extend the interview longer than I intended to. Tell me more about that concept.
I'll try and make it quick, but I guess what I would say is that there's a universal element in all slasher films, wherein if a slasher film runs long enough, at a certain point, it has to go into the supernatural because it has exhausted its limited premise from the beginning, and there are only two ways you can go with it. You can either jump the shark, like you can, say, make a third Halloween film that has nothing to do with the franchise and then have to course correct when the audience tells you it's wrong, or you can go with the audience and say, we made a Friday the 13th movie without Jason and no one wanted it, so we brought Jason back even though he's dead, and so he's just now a zombie because that's what you'd rather have. And so there's this universal element that says no matter how limited the premise is, if you go too far from it, the audience will course correct you and they will do it with their dollars. And that's something that I think is interesting. That's almost true about every horror franchise. There are outliers like Saw that didn't become supernatural, but in their own ways did sort of jump the shark a little bit. But the audience is the one, more than the filmmakers, that ultimately decides where you're allowed to go with the character because they eventually become the owners of the character.
Wow. No, I think that's really true. There was actually an SNL skit years ago, okay, that was about Soylent Green. And I always thought basically that nobody would get this skit except for like film geeks. But the skit goes, they do Soylent Green and then they decide to do a sequel. And in the sequel, it was called Soylent White. And it turned out that there was a conspiracy involved, and Soylent White was a different kind of thing. It wasn't people, and this was a new food stuff, and people didn't like it. So then they made Soylent Green 3, and it was just more Soylent Green, and it was still people. That was a huge hit. It was like, in other words, what people wanted to see in this imaginary Soylent Green series was just basically Soylent Green over and over again. And I think there's something to that. There's something awful about it but there's also something nice in the sense, just like we like to go to the same restaurant over and over if they serve something.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly emblematic of the honest truth about American film, which is that it's a business as much, if not more, than an art form, and that you can change things around the edges. You can paint the house a different color, but it's got to be the same house.
Right. However, have you noticed that I think another corollary that you could draw, and I want to read more about this idea you're talking about, but another one you could draw is that as a series goes on, because you have more time to talk about something, there's a tendency to do what Joseph Campbell calls concretizing the myth. The more you last, the more you're going to wind up explaining stuff that didn't really need to be explained, and learning that people are actually secret sisters of other characters. I'm thinking about Laurie, for instance, and Halloween.
Yeah.
And that's just a weird habit that we have, that as the series goes on, we wind up explaining the heck out of stuff. That
goes back to the very first sequel to the first slasher, which is Halloween 2, in which John Carpenter was pinned against a wall, didn't know what else to do, and decided that Michael Myers and Laurie Strode needed to be related, and that changes the entire trajectory of the series now. He's not a motiveless, crazy killer. He's a man who is, for some reason, stalking every member of his family, and that's where the series went for every step until he became, driven by a weird druid cult for some reason. But
he also, remember, he had I can't say this with a straight face. He had a psychic connection to his niece too.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and then when they touched, his evil went into her, and she became, child murderer.
So wonderful, and yet so completely far away from that extremely simple fairy tale of the first movie.
Yeah, well, it's like you said, Joseph Campbell said, the longer that you look at something, the more you explain it. And as we all know, no one likes Darth Vader more after the end of the prequels than they did at the end of the sequels.
That's so totally right. And actually, somebody talks about it in your book. Okay, seriously, we should wrap up. Tell me the URL again so that I can take it down and everybody else can as well.
Yes, the name of the blog is inthemargin.net, and the website for the book itself, which you can go and look at the opening chapter of to see if you want to buy it, is theanatomyofear.com.
With the V in it.
Yes.
Anatomy of Fear.
Yes, absolutely. And I should also mention, for anybody who buys a copy of the book, whether it's the text version or the e-version, there is a login and password on the last page of the book that takes you. We had so much material we couldn't put in a book that would be reasonably easy to carry around that we created a 100-plus page book of bonus chapters for anyone who buys it. So there's even more material than you get just in the textbook. So
fantastic. All right. Well, sir, I really appreciate you taking time.
Hello?
I accidentally switched phones, so there we go.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Are you still there? Anyway, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and I hope that we get a chance to hear from you again. And I'm going to hang up this.
Since you're doing a haunted house retrospective right now, I have to mention we got to talk to Ethan Wiley about the 2 House films, and even if it's not in your lineup, I definitely recommend anyone go out and watch those movies. They're really
I absolutely recommend House and House 2. Those are just fantastic. All right. I will talk to you soon, my friends. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you guys next week. Bye.